Good evening. I'm Kathy Lewis. The Virginia General Assembly adjourns tomorrow, but the work is by no means done. There is the issue of that nearly $4 billion hole in the state's budget, and we'll talk about that and other issues with our editorial roundtable, 4 journalists and bloggers who join us regularly for insights into the news. One member of our panel is not at our table tonight, and that's because Kimball Payne has been in Richmond covering the General Assembly for nearly 2 months now. He at the Holiday Inn there, and he joins us now from Richmond. Hi, Kimball. Good to talk with you today.
It's good to be here.
It's been a long session, hasn't it?
Well, it depends on long. We're getting there.
Yeah. What are you doing in terms of your coverage this week? It looks like so much of focuses on this budget and still the big unknowns.
Well, the budget is the big unknown, and it's been the story since, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months before the session. So right now, I mean, you're not seeing the pointed partisan philosophical differences that you're used to, but you're still seeing arguments, and you're still seeing, arguments about priorities and arguments about important things. You're talking about the amount of support staffers in public schools. You're talking about funding for higher education, beds for mental retardation. I mean, these are crucial issues. So, I mean, they're still hashing it out, and there's no agreement yet. I mean, it's one of these things where they keep knocking at the door until they can finally come together on the spending. So there's no telling where it's going to end up.
The spending certainly is one piece of it, but revenues are a piece of it as well, and that too is a little bit of a question mark, isn't it, with regard to what may come out of the federal government?
Well, that's one of the things that's been kind of the wild card this year is the federal stimulus plan and how much of that $787 billion Virginia is going to get. It's in the neighborhood of $4 billion, and so it's been a question of those numbers are kind of cloudy. How do we build our spending plan on fuzzy numbers? And then you have to kind of backtrack and backfill and fill out the rest of your budget. So the federal stimulus, I mean, that's been money that Virginia lawmakers are happy to have. I mean, they're very happy to have, but it's also created another layer to an already complex process.
One of the big pieces of news that's come out of this session, of course, is the smoking ban. And I remember weeks ago when you were actually here at the table with us, and I remember you were a little skeptical that thing was going to get through, and here we are.
Yeah, I really was skeptical, and I think a lot of people were. You saw sort of a momentum towards it, but it never seemed to be able to put the final piece in the puzzle. And I think, House Speaker William Howell was definitely that final piece in the puzzle that he came to the table and said, we got an election coming up. I've got some folks in Northern Virginia that are in increasingly Democratic areas. I need something for them to be able to take home as a big victory, for them to take home that's something that's popular, at least if you go by the polling. And I think you saw something where they said, listen, if we hold our ground, this is going to happen in 3 years, 2 years anyway. If we can get out on the front edge of this, maybe we can get some of the credit. So it's odd, though. I mean, it is psychologically for the Old Dominion to ban smoking. When you've got Philip Morris in Richmond and rolling 4 million cigarettes a day here, and just Virginia's links to tobacco going back to the 1600s. I mean, it's a major shift, I think, and it is a victory for Governor Kane. I think this is something he's had on his agenda, and to this moment he hasn't really had a legacy of sorts. He's kind of tried a couple of different things. Transportation fell flat, but this is something that I think he's going to hang his hat on, and as the DNC chief, try and go for the House of Delegates majority during the election, and that's another legacy moment. Can he make that happen?
And of course, the General Assembly at the moment is scheduled to adjourn on Saturday, but I guess that may or may not happen. Is that right?
Well, you always hear whispers about overtime. Today, Delegate Phil Hamilton, who's one of the budget negotiators, specifically, mentioned an impasse, mentioned potential overtime. You hope some of that's rhetorical. It's very odd. I mean, the General Assembly, I think, is a lot like all of us in that they're not as much fun when they don't have any money. And they're not having these wild disagreements. They're not having, knockdown, drag-out fights that they've had in the past. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there's still plenty of bickering, but I don't think overtime is coming. They may delay something until April when they all come back to consider amendments anyway, but that's been talked about and on the table for quite some time. They started off early this week very upbeat and positive about how close they are on a budget, and the House appears to be closer to Governor Kane on the budget. So I really have to believe that they're going to be able to come up with something by Saturday. The question is, I mean, it all gets down to functional at that point, because they've got to print these budgets. So you're talking about hours worth of printing just to get it done to make overtime. I mean, there are various logistical things that they've got to do to meet a deadline, and I've got to believe it's going to happen, but you never say never. You absolutely never say never up here.
All right, Kimball Payne, thank you so much for being with us from Richmond today, and we'll see you right here next time you're in town.
Good luck.
Thanks. Kimball Payne joining us from Richmond, where he's covering the General Assembly. Did everybody notice he had the coat and the tie on tonight? Vivian Page, nice to see you.
He looks great.
He does, doesn't he?
Yes.
Vivian Page with us tonight from blogvivianpage.com. We will go over here and introduce Don Lozado, who's with us, the editorial page editor at the Virginian Pilot. Good to see you, Don.
Good to see you.
And Brian Kerwin as well from bearingdrift.com. Nice to see you tonight.
Great to be back.
Yeah, so so what do we think about this budget conversation that's underway now in Richmond, and about the impact of this federal money? Big unknowns.
Love the comment about the people not being fun when there's no money.
That's great. Yeah.
That was perfect, because there is no money, and we're facing some really tough decisions to be made in this budget.
And anybody want to comment on the budget?
It was just, well, I wouldn't be surprised if they go into overtime. I'm just, with my friends at Bearing Drift, we're loving the fact that the Democrats, who are finally in the majority of one of the houses of the General Assembly for the first time in about a decade, fumbling with their main responsibility. They can't agree with the governor of their own party on budget priorities. So, and as Kimball said, the House and the governor are closer than the governor and a Democratic Senate. They better get their ducks in a row if we're going to close on time.
I mean, the budget is always interesting to watch. I think it's more interesting this year for a variety of reasons, all of which Kimball said. But I think what's interesting is the stimulus money has been spent about 10 times by my count. And so even if they do figure out where they're going to put it specifically this year, I'd be surprised if it's all settled.
And some interesting changes on the scene, certainly as we take a look at the next elections that are coming up. You have Kim Alvin saying, "I'm done. Thank you so much. I'm finished."
It's been an interesting thing to watch, because I didn't have any sense that he was ready to leave. I happened to be at the General Assembly last week and spent some time with him, and I didn't have any sense that he was ready to retire. But I guess with the rumblings of him becoming a judge is probably something that's moving in that direction.
Mm-hmm. So what does that mean then, politically speaking?
Well,
does that open that up?
Well, it certainly opens. My understanding is that you cannot be appointed a judge to a judgeship as a sitting member, and so the idea is that he's going to actually resign at some point this summer, be appointed by the governor to a position, to a judgeship in Portsmouth, and then be confirmed by the General Assembly in January. So, interestingly enough, John Edwards is being. I just saw his name on the list today, being considered for a judgeship, and he's still sitting in the Senate right now. So I don't know how that's working, but nevertheless, that's my understanding of it.
One of the things that has happened since last we gathered our group together is I think the tremendously symbolic closure of one of the plants at Smithfield Foods, and the fact that the net loss is something on the order of 600 and some jobs. So
I think at most, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean,
major number.
Compared to what it could be, I suppose that's. But the significance and the symbolism of Smithfield Foods closing the plant in Smithfield, one of the two.
Well, it's a company name for the town, and it's closing one of its plants. The corporate headquarters is staying there, obviously, but some jobs are leaving the area. I think it's hit that community very hard. It does something about your identity when you're, the largest employer.
And when you're talking about a company that is, as many of these big companies are, the ones that are left in Hampton Roads, are really the go-to companies for organizations in this community, for nonprofits and all the rest of it. Yeah. It is a significant blow.
Well, and the nonprofits are just desperate. I think, you hear this in every business, everybody I talk to. I don't know of anybody who's doing better now than they were a year ago, but the nonprofits are struggling horribly. And I would not be surprised to see some major nonprofits in our area have to do things very differently in the next year.
Forgive me, but, there's a lot of need that's being met by nonprofits. But it seems to me that nonprofits and others have been looking at the idea of doing business differently in some ways. And one of the things that we've talked about from time to time is that necessity sometimes drives that. And so maybe, maybe the hope is that some of them will sort of get together and look at different ways that they might begin to do business.
One would hope so, but I think the other thing is the need is so much greater.
Huge,
as people
and growing every day.
Yeah,
right.
And as people lose their jobs, as families that were on the edge really explode, the demand for these services is only growing, and they don't have the money. The money's not coming in. You talk to churches; they don't have the money that they're expecting.
Yeah.
These are some pretty difficult times for all of them.
That was actually tied into the issue of the stimulus package coming to this area, because there was a poverty study that was released last week or the week before that talked about even if we got the stimulus money, that it really wasn't going to come into effect until 2010. Most of it wouldn't get here until then. In the meantime, the number of Virginians who are falling into poverty as a result of an increase in the unemployment rate, and a large number of those are children. So we've got to realize that the nonprofits really do need, particularly the ones who are like the food banks and stuff that are actually feeding these folks, that they're really going to be hurting, and we as a society are going to be hurting, even though the stimulus money is on its way. We're still going to have some major issues.
We have an abundance of blessings in Hampton Roads. We're not being hit as hard as even the rest of the Commonwealth, let alone the rest of the nation. Our employment figures are not dropping quite as severely. We haven't had the hit in the housing market. So far, it hasn't really arrived to the degree that it might, and to the degree it's arrived elsewhere.
And that's completely typical of Hampton Roads.
It is.
Right.
It is.
It's one of the reasons why this defense dependency is a sort of a blessing and a curse at the same time.
Absolutely.
In the sense that it does shelter you from really dreadful times. Kind of keeps the lid on a little bit in really good times as well.
Yeah, they're really good.
Yeah.
They're speed bumps.
Yeah.
It doesn't get too hot and doesn't get too cold. It keeps everything just right.
As we think about some of the issues that came out of the General Assembly this time around, of course, adjournment tomorrow, at least that's what's scheduled. The smoking ban. Were you all surprised that smoking ban wound up passing?
Yeah.
I was not. It seemed time that for that in the Commonwealth, as it's been time elsewhere in the country for a long time now. But the player that Kimball didn't mention is Chris Jones, the delegate from Suffolk. He is really the one character in this whole drama who has changed from year to year, and I think he probably deserves a great deal of credit for getting this done. And
wasn't he the one who essentially, in his new role, sort of got the bill around the committee that typically...
The subcommittee, yeah.
Subcommittee, sorry, thank you, Brian. Yeah, that typically just kills it.
I love giving Chris Jones credit. I'm sure he didn't do that without the Speaker's blessing.
Oh, yeah.
So, Bill Howell...
Well, the Speaker looked at the numbers, realized he was in a district that went for Obama. And he's not the only one who's in a district like that.
Well,
and so there was no way. John Cosgrove was the one who surprised me the most. To see him go from being adamant, basically adamant that, and actually he and I had talked about the fact that Virginia doesn't have
John Cosgrove, delegate from Chesapeake.
Right.
Yeah.
Virginia doesn't have a law that designates bars versus restaurants. So,
and he basically said, "Look, they send us there to do their will, and that's what we've done."
It
was not. It was not like, "Ooh, I'm into this."
The polls were overwhelming. Less than 30% of America smoke. So guess what? Less than 30% oppose the smoking ban. And the arguments against it just, I wrote on the blog, it was spurious. There was property rights. Yeah, I have a property. If I go into a restaurant, I want the right to breathe.
Right.
If I work in a restaurant and I'm a non-smoker, why should I be forced to inhale?
One of the hardest things about this is that Brian and I are on opposite sides of this, and our positions should be flipped. But the truth is that I just totally disagree with the idea of a smoking ban. At least one, as it came down this way.
Well, I think it's the
heavy hand of government.
Moment. We need to stop and pause and capture. Just take a deep cleansing breath and take in this moment, ladies and gentlemen. Go ahead.
Well, the argument, I thought what was interesting is the argument was about property rights. It was about, I don't want to go to a restaurant and have my clothes smell like smoke. But for us and for me, it was always about the workers, about the safety of having to work in an environment where people are smoking. You don't necessarily have a choice there, especially in an economy like this, that you can just leave and go find a place where people aren't smoking.
And I don't know. I think that all the transit buses are non-smoking, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure that they are. That was my segue into the transit conversation. It's brilliant, wasn't it? That's what I get paid.
Some of them are non-riding.
The big public riding.
That's the reason why.
That's right. There you go. There you go. But we did have the unveiling of this regional transportation plan last week, and the public got a chance to sort of look at it and talk about it this week. And this regional transportation plan is very much predicated on light rail, very much predicated on express buses, commuter buses, and that kind of thing. What did you think about the plan?
I thought the plan was a good place to start. As I do, light rail in Norfolk is a great place to start, but it's not at all anything like a system. They started calling it a starter line, which I think is intentional, to let us know.
Reduce expectations.
Well, we got a long way to go here, and Virginia Beach and Norfolk Southern still can't seem to reach a deal on their right-of-way, and that's a crucial part of this. And then the bases need to be tied in. I mean, there's
patience, my good son.
But the other piece of this that's interesting in terms of light rail is we had Mayor Will Sessoms here a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying, look, I campaigned, I'm paraphrasing him, I hope I've got this right, I campaigned saying I would, try to take this to referendum if that's what the people wanted. So he's not backing down off that. So there is still this issue of going to referendum in Virginia Beach, apparently. But he says he'll get out and enthusiastically support it this time.
Well, the whole thing about the referendum, and it may happen, it may not.
Yeah.
The important thing is the people in Norfolk better be careful because they called it a starter line and Virginia Beach heard it. They want to see what that starter line does. If people in Norfolk embrace it and ride it, the end result's going to be the same. People are going to say, oh, I want that to extend to me. If it crash lands and people don't ride it and there's the trains and nobody's on it and it's just like the HRT buses, I don't care what the referendum says, it's going to hit a roadblock going into Virginia Beach.
But as you think about, sorry, go ahead, Vivian.
I was agreeing, yeah.
As you look at
another moment.
As you look at the bus situation, though, Michael Townsend said this is a skeletal system. I mean, and his contention is, and I think it's a contention of a lot of people who are in the transit business, you almost have to have it to be a certain size in order for enough people to be able to use it as a reasonable transportation option.
Well, it's beyond that. I mean, buses don't drive development. And this is going to sound circular, but stay with me for a minute. Buses don't drive development. Rail does. And if you have development, you have greater use of the rail, and so it's a self-reinforcing cycle. And that's what they're hoping, is that when you develop in a certain way around these rail stops, you'll get people using it more and more, and then that sort of success will spread.
I think Michael Towns was part of the same organization that was asking for the starter line to get the ball moving. And whether or not he was surprised that it actually worked, that was the argument.
Yeah.
And now to come back and say, well, if it fails, well, you kind of have to expect that.
Okay.
No.
All right, you're going to hold his feet to the fire. Okay.
The test is on. It's got to be successful in Norfolk, or that's all it's going to be.
Right.
Let's talk for a moment, and I know this will come as a huge disappointment to Brian that we're going to talk about SPSA for a moment because
Give me a pillow.
You think this is a boring story, right? The Southeastern Public Service Authority.
I have my finger on the pulse of the voters. And
Nobody cares.
They care. Their eyes glazed.
Okay, fair enough.
Until somebody has a solution, okay, talk about the problem some more.
The biggest problem is I don't think that they understand what it could cost us. And I think the more we talk about it, the more the public has an opportunity to understand what it could cost us. When the governor says to all the member communities that if SPSA goes under, the state is going to pay the debt and is going to take it away from the 8 member communities' money. That translates into somehow or another, we as taxpayers of the 8 member communities are going to have to figure out how we're going to pay for the rest of our stuff.
And it's $240 million in debt.
It's $240 million in debt. I mean, this is an enormous debt that has to be satisfied essentially in less than 10 years. And what they're talking about doing is the tipping fees are already the highest.
This is the agency that deals with trash, recycling, that sort of stuff.
But we already, I think, pay the highest, or most of us, pay the highest tip fees in the nation. And they're talking about raising them by 2 or 3 times just so they have the money on hand that they need to pay their bills. That's an astonishing
I just have one question.
Consideration.
We heard one time that we may not have to raise tipping fees because of the sale of a part of the operation.
Right. And
we only heard it one time. We haven't heard it since. Where's the rest of that story? I mean, in all honesty, where's the rest? Don Williams, who's the chair of the board, stood up in front of the City Council of Norfolk and said, you know what, we may not have to raise tipping fees at all because we're going to sell off this part of the operation that's going to bring in enough money to pay down the debt, and we won't even have to raise tipping fees.
And this week, though, there was the rejection of a proposal to
for a
purchase
small
bits
piece.
of it.
You're talking about the waste-to-energy plant, the incinerator,
Right.
and they're talking about selling that off.
Two buyers at the moment.
Two
right?
buyers, and what I hear, although the companies will not say, is that those offers are in the neighborhood of satisfying that debt, somewhere north of $200 million for that plant.
Well, this was
I think they're waiting for the pot to get sweetened.
Yeah. Well,
That's
I mean,
my
I'm
guess.
sure they are, but we haven't heard anything about it since. I mean, we really haven't. We heard that one story that came out, and that was it. So I just want to know where it is.
In the meantime, SPSA has announced it's going to be laying off 42 people.
Right.
As part of this this operation. Are your eyes glazed over?
Totally.
Totally. All right. So well, here's what we'll do. Here's what we'll do. We will ask our viewers whether they care about this SPSA story, and we'll find out if anybody emails us or calls us, and we'll find out if they care.
I mean, I care about the SPSA story.
Yeah.
It's just what to talk about.
It is a hard story to talk about. You're exactly right. It is
What's
tough.
the solution?
Yeah.
Nobody knows.
Well, but isn't one of the
Solution
possible
is to
solutions
sell it
to
off.
sell off?
How long has SPSA been a mess?
The solution is to sell it and take it private. It is obvious that what we've done is not working because
And the
that's
business
not
has
working.
changed
It's
since that
time
time.
for us to
Yeah.
try something else.
The business has changed, but we also didn't pay the freight for a lot of years.
That's true.
And so we ended up digging a hole, and now we got to climb out.
And on that cheery note,
Sorry.
I'm happy to have had y'all back again. We'll hope that Kimball Payne will be back with us soon. We assume that the General Assembly is going to be adjourning tomorrow. We will wait to hear if that's the case. And I'll be back in just a moment with a final thought. As we just mentioned a few moments ago, Hampton Roads Transit made 2 presentations this week to anybody who would listen and ask for input on building a better transit system. And based on what I've learned recently from a regional planner, a better transit system can't come a moment too soon. Dwight Farmer, who is a traffic engineer who now heads the Regional Planning District Commission, said recently, and I think I have this right, that if each of us stayed off the road one day in 10, it would eliminate rush hour congestion, or at least put a pretty big dent in it. So let me repeat that, because I had to ask Dwight to repeat it as well. If you randomly picked one day out of 10, took your car off the road, we could come close to eliminating rush hour congestion. Now that is powerful stuff, and it doesn't mean we won't have to build roads or bridges, but it does mean that there is actually something we can do that does not require lawmakers or traffic engineering studies or bulldozers or pavers. It just requires 2 things: the will to change our habits and the availability of a good public transportation system. Now, the first one is ours to decide, and the second is a little bit more complicated. We have what Hampton Roads Transit's executive director calls a skeletal system at best, and my little weekend experiment proves the point. The trip to and from work that typically takes me 12 minutes by car would take 50 minutes by bus and involve waiting for a transfer. So for me, it's probably not feasible to take public transportation to work. But when I looked at my schedule over the next 10 days, I found a trip from Norfolk to downtown Hampton, and that's where I hit pay dirt. You see, I can drive my car 1 mile to one of HRT's transfer stations, climb aboard the Max, which is HRT's new commuter bus that comes complete with comfy seats and Wi-Fi. They put a latte on there, I'll be in business. And then I can be in Hampton in the same amount of time it would take me to drive. And HRT's online calculator says it'll cost me half what it would have cost to drive it. So I'm going to give it a try. And I'll take the bus to my board meeting and let you know how it goes. By the way, if you're interested in looking at your own next 10 days to see if you could give public transit a try, just log on to HRT's website at gohrt.com. And we'll put that link on our website as well, which is whatmatters.tv. And while you're there, you can sign up for our weekly e-bit. We'll let you know what other programs we have in the works for you. You can also visit us on Facebook or email us at whatmatters@whro.org. Now, if you want to go by the way of the post office, you can write to us at 5200 Hampton Boulevard, Norfolk, Virginia, 23505, or call us at 889-9425. Any way you choose, we are always glad to hear from you. Before we go, there's something extraordinary happening at the Wells Theater through March 15th. It's a theatrical depiction of a moment in Hampton Roads history that continues to reverberate today. The Virginia Stage Company is doing something meaningful and ambitious. Beyond the schedule of exceptional performances they always bring us, they've started an effort to add one play each season about an episode in our regional history. And in this, the 50th anniversary year of the end of massive resistance, the play is an original written by artistic director Chris Hanna. A Line in the Sand has its world premiere tonight and will be on the Virginia stage through March 15th. It's the story of the efforts of some Norfolk citizens to reopen the public schools that had been shuttered to defy court-ordered racial integration. Chris Hanna has woven excerpts from original media coverage, court documents, and personal accounts of those who were there, along with his own wonderful imagination. And we all had a hand in shaping this play in some respects, because Chris did a courageous thing. He invited the community into the theater to help him make sure that the play did what it was supposed to do, help us examine that moment and the legacy it leaves us. A Line in the Sand is performed through March 15th. Tickets range from $10 to $42.50, so there's something there for just about everyone. Call 671-8100 if you'd like tickets, or visit the Virginia Stage at vastage.com. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week for another look at what matters.